It was a crisp autumn afternoon in downtown Atlanta, the kind of day where the sky stretches wide and clean above a city steeped in history and renewal, where amber sunlight filtered through the trees that lined Peachtree Street, casting long, dappled shadows across the pavement, as a subtle breeze whispered through the avenues like the voice of memory itself. And as the city moved to its modern rhythm, car horns, bus engines, laughter from sidewalk cafes, no one noticed at first the elderly black man, slowly making his way down the sidewalk, tapping his cane against the concrete in a steady rhythm that matched the quiet dignity of his pace. His name was Jeremiah Ironfoot Johnson, a 90-year-old veteran of the Korean War and the Vietnam War, a man who had served his country in battles both abroad and at home, who had faced gunfire in dense foreign jungles and racism in the very land he defended, who had buried comrades under flags and watched governments change, while justice moved far too slow for men who looked like him. And though his back was hunched and his steps careful, there was an unmistakable pride in his bearing, something noble that time could not extinguish, for on that day he wore his age like a uniform, clad in a weather-beaten olive-green jacket adorned with worn but preserved patches of his rank and unit, along with a faded cap bearing the insignia of the Marine Corps, a small embroidered eagle, globe and anchor pressed slightly askew atop. His graying hair, and as he made his way past the glassy storefronts and polished towers of a city rebuilt by struggle, few knew that they were walking alongside a living monument, a man who had bled for freedom but never sought recognition, who lived in modest silence with a heart full of memories too heavy to share with strangers, memories of brothers who never made it home, of firefights and foxholes, of a country that drafted him to fight and then questioned his right to vote. And yet here he was, an enduring figure etched with lines of resilience, slowly navigating the concrete jungle with a grace born not of privilege, but perseverance. Jeremiah had set out that morning like he always did on Saturdays, taking the number 11 bus downtown, just to walk through the city he had once watched from bunkers overseas, feeling the pulse of the place he loved, despite all it had taken from him. And he paused near the crosswalk on Peachtree and 7th Street, not because he needed help, but because he liked to stop and look at the skyline, the traffic, the families rushing by, the young couples giggling with iced coffees, the street musicians setting up amps for the afternoon. And though arthritis gnawed at his joints and every breath took more effort than the last, he stood still, with the posture of a man who had earned the right to observe the world without apology. A few yards away, a group of teenagers loitered by the corner, their energy loud and directionless, 3 boys and 2 girls, maybe 16 or 17, dressed in hoodies and sneakers, shouting over each other about who could go viral on TikTok. Next, laughing with the reckless volume of youth, oblivious to the weight of the world around them, until one of the boys, tall, wiry, full of swagger he hadn't earned, noticed Jeremiah, nudged his friend and pointed, cracking a joke that made the others burst into laughter. And what began as snickers soon turned into mimicry as the teens exaggerated Jeremiah's walk, shuffling their feet and clutching invisible canes. And Jeremiah, having seen far worse in his life, gave no reaction. He didn't even turn his head, simply exhaled slowly and prepared to cross the street. But in that moment, the boldest boy in the group, emboldened by the laughter of his peers, and unaware of the history behind the man he mocked, took a few steps forward, called out, "Move it, Grandpa!" and with a sudden, cruel push to Jeremiah's back, sent the elderly veteran stumbling forward into the street. It was as if the entire world fell silent in that instant. The busy street paused in horror as Jeremiah's cane clattered to the ground, his arms flailed in slow motion, and he fell, his frail frame slamming hard against the asphalt as a chorus of gasps rose from onlookers nearby. Tires screeched as cars slammed their brakes. A horn blared somewhere down the block, and for a split second, Atlanta itself seemed to hold its breath, watching this noble elder lie motionless in the street, his beloved Marine Corps cap tumbling away like a forgotten crown, coming to rest beside a storm drain, while the boy who shoved him stood frozen in the realization that his prank had gone too far. Some pedestrians rushed toward Jeremiah. Others fumbled for their phones to call 911 or record the moment. But before anyone could reach him, a different sound pierced the noise. A sound not of panic, but of purpose. The heavy, synchronized footfalls of boots on pavement, fast and deliberate, coming from multiple directions, and what no one yet knew was that less than a block away, at the Georgian Grand Hotel, a Marine Corps reunion was in full swing, a gathering of veterans and active duty service members, men and women who had come to honor their fallen brothers and sisters, who had stories stitched into their souls that civilians could never comprehend, and among them were several who had once served under Jeremiah Ironfoot Johnson himself, warriors who owed their lives to the man now lying injured in the street, and it took less than 15 seconds for them to respond. Like trained hounds to a whistle only they could hear, the Marines surged from the hotel lobby and onto the street, recognizing instantly what had happened, not just the fall of a man, but the fall of a legend, and their training, their discipline, their loyalty all ignited in an instant. Staff Sergeant Andre Riley, still in his formal blues from the morning's memorial service, sprinted across the crosswalk, his 6'4" frame cutting through the crowd like a blade, while gunnery, Sergeant Maria Torres barked orders to someone to block traffic and ensure Jeremiah wouldn't be hit again. A younger corporal dropped to his knees beside the fallen elder, checking for consciousness, calling out, "Corpsman!" as instinct took over, and within seconds, the group of teenagers who had seconds ago laughed so freely now found themselves surrounded by a growing perimeter of stone-faced Marines, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes but unmistakable in bearing, each of them moving with silent, precise fury as they assessed the situation with cold efficiency. The boy who shoved Jeremiah stammered something unintelligible, his voice cracking under the sudden pressure of a presence he couldn't understand, his friends backing away in shame as the tallest Marine stepped forward and said with a quiet, restrained rage, "Do you have any idea who you just laid hands on?" And it wasn't just a question, it was a demand, a challenge, a reprimand from a warrior speaking on behalf of all who had ever served. Someone retrieved Jeremiah's hat, brushing it gently with trembling hands before placing it back on his head with the kind of reverence reserved for folded flags and final salutes, and as a small crowd gathered in awe, watching a human wall of discipline form around the injured elder, a hush fell over Peachtree Street, broken only by the calls for an ambulance and the murmurs of those who recognized the name Jeremiah Johnson and realized with growing shock that the man lying in the street was not just another elderly pedestrian. He was a decorated hero, a living legend, a man who had led rescue missions in jungles where hope had vanished, who had been awarded the Silver Star and Purple Heart, who had mentored generations of Marines long after his retirement, who had lost everything in war and still stood proud in peace. And now here he was, humiliated by a child too young to grasp the magnitude of his actions. But Jeremiah, though in pain, slowly opened his eyes, his vision blurry but clearing enough to recognize the boots around him, the voices he knew, the hands that lifted him gently, and as he was helped to a seated position, his first words were, not of anger or fear, but of resilience. "Didn't think I'd go out this way," he muttered with a wry grin, and the Marines around him chuckled softly, their eyes glassy but determined, their presence not just a shield, but a tribute, a living testament that no Marine is ever truly alone. And in that moment, a generation stood beside their elder, not because they had to, but because they must, because in the heart of downtown Atlanta, a lesson was unfolding not just for the teens who mocked a hero, but for a nation that too often forgets its guardians, until they fall. And now, with the sirens in the distance and the sun still shining overhead, the city would remember, for the boots that now stood around Jeremiah Johnson weren't just there to protect him, they were there to honor the very soul of service. The street, still basking in the golden hush of a quiet fall afternoon, had become a cathedral of reckoning, a sacred ground where reverence clashed with ignorance, and as the towering presence of Marines surrounded the bewildered teens, the city itself seemed to lean in, listening, breathing, bearing witness to a moment that transcended age and time, where the sins of arrogance would be answered by the creed of service, discipline, and brotherhood forged in fire. Staff Sergeant Riley stood like a statue hewn from granite, his body angled in quiet menace, arms crossed across his chest like the gates of judgment itself, his eyes boring into the teenager who had just moments ago shoved a living hero into traffic, and the boy, tall, thin, mouth open in a stammer of regret, now found his swagger vaporized by the weight of men who had seen war, who had stared into the maw of death and returned not just whole, but wholly with purpose. And around him, the other teens shrank as Gunnery Sergeant Maria Torres stepped forward like thunder, her voice as sharp and precise as rifle fire. "You just put your hands on a Marine," she said, her voice low, deliberate, cutting through the air like a blade dipped in history. Not just any Marine, but a man who led point through rice, paddies laced with mines, who lost a leg to an IED and kept walking anyway, who saw friends bleed out under his command and never once left a soul behind. And the boys' lips parted, but no words came, for what could be said in the face of such truth. And now one by one the Marines spoke, not in anger, but with the controlled, seething calm of those trained not to lash out, but to instill something deeper. Understanding. A younger corporal, still in his 20s, tattoos barely hidden beneath his rolled sleeves, turned to the boy and said, "That man's the reason I'm standing here. My uncle served under him in Nam and used to tell stories about Ironfoot Johnson, like he was carved from legend." And another added, "He's the kind of Marine who didn't ask for recognition, didn't need medals to know his worth." And as each voice joined the chorus, the lesson deepened, layering memory upon memory, truth upon truth, until the teens stood not before a crowd, but before a tribunal of honor, each Marine embodying decades of sacrifice, pain, loyalty, and courage. Meanwhile, Jeremiah Johnson, cradled gently by the arms of a Navy corpsman who had rushed across traffic without a second thought, looked on with clear, glassy eyes, and despite the dull throb in his hip and the bruises blossoming beneath his skin, he gave a slight nod, as if to say, "Let them learn." Because for all his strength, Jeremiah had never been a man of punishment. He was a man of principle, and he understood the ignorance of youth better than most, for he had seen what it could do when fed by hatred instead of wisdom. And if there was a chance these children could leave the street better than they arrived, then even this pain was worth it. The growing crowd of bystanders watched in absolute silence, phones held high to record what could not be forgotten, not for virality, but because moments like these stitched the soul of a nation back together, old and young, black and white, soldier and civilian, everyone now united by the gravity of one man's legacy and the invisible but invincible wall of Marines that rose in his defense. "We're not here to hurt you," Riley finally said, voice low but electric with command. "But you need to understand the magnitude of what you did, because that push, that wasn't just disrespect. That was betrayal. Betrayal of everything he stood for, everything he gave so you could walk these streets free." And for a long moment the wind carried nothing but silence, until a teenage girl among the group burst into tears, not from fear but shame, her mascara running as she whispered, "We didn't know. We didn't know." And another boy, shaking now, dropped to his knees beside Jeremiah and said, "I'm so sorry, sir, right, please, I didn't mean to." But the Marine beside him held up a hand and said, "He doesn't need your apology. He needs your respect. If you really mean it, then prove it by how you live after this." And that was when something unexpected happened. Staff Sergeant Riley reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a challenge coin, gold-rimmed, bearing the emblem of the 1st Marine Division, and placed it in the boy's palm. "You earn that," he said, "by being better, starting now." And though the teen's fingers trembled, he closed them slowly around the coin, nodding, his throat too tight to speak, because something ancient and unspoken had passed between them. Not absolution, but responsibility. Meanwhile, paramedics finally arrived, weaving through the respectfully parted sea of uniforms, and as they gently lifted Jeremiah onto a stretcher, the Marines snapped to attention in unison, boots clicking, backs straight, not because they were ordered to, but because reverence demanded it, and one by one civilians followed their lead, some placing hands over hearts, some removing hats, some saluting through tears. And as the stretcher wheeled past the teenagers, Jeremiah turned his head slightly and said, "Don't waste this chance. Life doesn't always give you do-overs." And with that, he was loaded into the ambulance, the doors closed, and the sirens rose, not a wail of panic, but a herald's cry that something sacred had transpired. And in the hours that followed, the story exploded across social media and news outlets, not just as another viral clip of confrontation, but as a living parable about reverence, humility, and generational memory, an unexpected lesson carved, not into a chalkboard but into pavement and pain, and the names were soon known to all. Jeremiah Johnson, the Marine who survived 3 wars and carried silent wounds deeper than any scar, now lionized not by medals, but by the Marines he had shaped, and the teens, nameless still, now carried an invisible burden, to grow, to change, to one day earn the right to walk beside the giants they had once disrespected. That night, as lights dimmed across Atlanta, several of the Marines remained on that same corner, talking not of anger but of legacy, of how honor must be taught, passed down like heirlooms from scarred hands to soft palms, and one young private said, "You think they'll learn from this?" And Riley answered, "They'll never forget it because moments like that don't fade. They brand the soul, shaping character from shame, and even in the darkest ignorance, light waits to be lit." Meanwhile, at the VA hospital across town, Jeremiah lay resting, his vitals steady, his eyes closed, a slight smile on his lips as a nurse adjusted his blankets and whispered, "You've got half the corps waiting to see you, sir," and he chuckled faintly. "Let 'em wait," he said. "I've been marching long enough." And with that, the old Marine drifted to sleep, not alone, not forgotten, but held up by the very legacy he built, while outside, the Marines stood sentinel, not just over his body, but over everything he had ever fought for. As dusk settled over the city and the lights of Atlanta flickered like stars reborn in concrete, the sterile calm of the VA hospital stood in stunning contrast to the chaos of the day. But inside room 417, history, redemption, and legacy all collided in a hushed and sacred stillness. For Jeremiah Johnson, the 90-year-old Marine whose body bore the map of American wars and whose soul carried the memory of blood spilled for freedoms often taken for granted, lay in a hospital bed with wires attached to his chest, a soft beeping heart monitor, counting out the rhythm of a life too epic to summarize, and beside him, forming a new kind of wall now, were his Marines, both young and old, black, white, Latino, Asian, standing shoulder to shoulder not in formation but in reverence, for they had come not to protect but to remember, to bear witness, to ensure the soul of one of their finest was never alone again, and Jeremiah, though sore and bruised, cracked open his eyes and found himself staring into a room transformed, not to just by their presence, but by what they carried with them. Medals dulled by time but brightened by love. Photos of unit reunions, yellowing letters written under ponchos in the jungles of Vietnam, dog tags of those long gone, and with each artifact came a story, and with each story came a tear, and as Gunnery Sergeant Torres read aloud a citation from Jeremiah's Silver Star Award, earned during a fierce firefight in Nam, where he carried 2 wounded men on his back through sniper fire, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, not even among the teenagers who now stood awkwardly near the door, escorted in not by force, but by something far heavier, accountability for a judge, an aging woman with a stern jaw softened by wisdom, had ruled that before these youths could face community service or sentencing, they would first have to stand before the man they had shoved and hear his truth. And so they stood, silent and shaken, their bravado stripped, their phones stashed away, their eyes darting between Marines whose very presence seemed to rewrite the very definition of strength. And when Jeremiah noticed them, he didn't scowl or demand apology. Instead, he motioned with a tired hand and said, "Let 'em come." And when they hesitated, a Marine said softly, "That's an order," and they approached, trembling in the quiet air that felt like church. And once they stood before him, Jeremiah's voice, weathered, soft but unyielding, cut through the stillness. "Y'all thought it was funny shoving an old man didn't know or didn't care who I was, but I'm not mad," he said, pausing as the room held its breath. "I'm disappointed, not because of what you did to me, but what it says about how far we've drifted." And the words, slow and intentional, settled into the bones of everyone listening. "I didn't bleed on foreign soil, see brothers die, watch my best friend, get zipped in a bag just so young people could grow up thinking disrespect is power," he said. And now his eyes locked onto theirs, not with rage but with deep, aching sorrow. And then he added, "But I'm still here, which means you got a chance to get it right. And then he began to tell his story, not for pity but for perspective, and as he spoke, the room transformed from hospital ward into sacred archive, a living museum of courage, hardship, and dignity, as Jeremiah recounted growing up in Jim Crow, Mississippi, walking 5 miles past segregated schools to attend his own rundown one-room shack of an education, told he'd never amount to anything, and yet when war came, he didn't hesitate to serve a country that didn't yet serve him, enlisting at 17 with his mama's forged signature and shipping off to Korea, where he saw snow for the first time while fighting in the bitter cold, sleeping in foxholes beside men who didn't look like him, but who bled red all the same, and then again in Vietnam, where jungles swallowed whole platoons and trust was more valuable than ammo, where he earned the name Iron Foot after stepping on a mine and continuing to walk while dragging another wounded Marine to safety, and the room fell into reverent silence as he shared how, after all that, he came home not to parades, but to silence rejection and doors slammed in his face, denied jobs, spit on in uniform, yet never once cursing the flag he served under, because to Jeremiah, America wasn't about who it was about who it could become, and those words, spoken without bitterness, cracked open something raw in the teens who had never heard a story like this, not from a book, but from a man who had lived every brutal syllable of it, and tears began to spill, not performative, but real, as one girl whispered, "I didn't know." "I never knew," and Jeremiah simply nodded and said, "That's why you're here." And then something beautiful happened. The Marines began to speak not of war, but of Jeremiah, how he trained them, fed them when they had nothing, showed them how to shave before inspections, loaned them cash from his own pocket when pay got delayed, how he never raised his voice unless it was to defend someone, how he never missed a funeral, how his letters to widows were poetry and steel combined, and one Marine, a burly man with tattoos up to his neck and a voice rough as gravel, choked as he said, "He saved my life, not in combat, but after. I was going to take myself out after I got discharged. He called me, just called me out of nowhere, asked if I was okay. I wasn't. But after that call I started getting better. And in that moment, Jeremiah wasn't just a veteran. He was a lighthouse in the dark for an entire generation of warriors, and the teens, overwhelmed now, asked what they could do, and the judge, listening quietly in the corner, said, "It starts with learning, then serving," and thus began a moment of change, not punishment but transformation, as the teens were assigned to interview veterans at the VA for the next 6 months, to record their stories, to transcribe memories fading too fast, and Jeremiah looked each one in the eye and said, "When you know where you come from, you walk different," and they nodded, now not out of fear, but reverence. And as the night deepened, and the Marines stood to leave in staggered rotations, Jeremiah closed his eyes, exhausted but content, knowing that for the first time in a long while, maybe a new generation had heard the call, not of war but of wisdom. And in that quiet, with moonlight sneaking through half-closed blinds, the old warrior slept not as a victim, but as a teacher, his story now theirs to carry, not as shame, but as a torch passed hand to hand, and outside the hospital, those same teens stood for a long while staring up at the flag fluttering in the night wind, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, and perhaps for the very first time, they understood why it mattered. Weeks passed, and the city that had once turned its head away from the brutal shove of an elderly black war hero was now wholly transformed into a mosaic of remembrance, healing, and collective honor, as the story of Jeremiah Johnson continued to swell beyond the community center, beyond the nightly news, and beyond the cracked pavement where injustice had once flared, reaching the ears and hearts of citizens across the nation. And now, on a brisk yet clear Saturday morning, thousands gathered at the intersection where the shameful act had taken place, a location now reborn through unity, repentance, and education, cordoned off by velvet ropes adorned with wreaths of red, white, and blue, and flanked by the polished boots of an entire Marine Corps honor guard standing in solemn formation, their stoic expressions matched only by the rows upon rows of folding chairs filled with civilians, service members, and students alike, all of whom had come not merely to witness history, but to become a part of it. And there at the front of the crowd stood the once disgraced teens, now transformed, heads held high in pressed navy blue service uniforms bearing the patch of the Jeremiah Johnson Youth Corps, a community service program created in the veterans' honor that now spanned 3 states and was being adopted by schools across the country as a model for restorative justice and civic education. And as these young men and women, once seen only as symbols of reckless cruelty, stood waiting with eyes fixed forward and palms sweating beneath white gloves, an air of nervous reverence blanketed the crowd, for they knew what was coming would be bigger than any apology, any speech, any punishment. They were about to complete a transformation, and before them sat the man whose life had become the catalyst for their metamorphosis, Jeremiah, now seated upright in a handcrafted oak chair, designed and built by one of the teens himself, wearing his full dress uniform adorned with every medal earned in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, including the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the rarely awarded Marine Corps Combatant's Cross, with white gloves covering the trembling hands that had once carried comrades across burning fields. And beside him sat General Thomas Keane, the highest-ranking Marine in the southeastern region, along with the mayor, the governor, and dignitaries from across the political spectrum, all gathered not for politics, but to honor a legacy. And when the ceremony began, the air grew still as a school choir, comprised of students from 5 local high schools, sang America the Beautiful with tearful voices, followed by the national anthem performed by the Marine Corps Band, their brass and percussion echoing across the blocks in solemn majesty. And then came the moment no one was prepared for. The teens stepped forward one by one, each carrying a folded piece of parchment, each representing the parts of themselves they had once lost to ignorance and regained through service. And Darnell, once the ringleader, now a youth corps captain, stood at the podium, voice low but unwavering, as he read aloud the letter. He had written by hand the night he spent on the floor of the community center, weeping beside Jeremiah's boots, a letter that began with, "To the man I hurt, the hero I wronged, and the future I now vow to honor." And as he read, tears streamed freely down the cheeks of both young and old, and the words, descriptions of guilt, of awakening, of gratitude, rose into the sky like prayers. And when he finished, he folded the letter and knelt before Jeremiah, who with a shaking hand removed his glove and laid it gently on Darnell's shoulder, pulling him close with a strength not of muscle, but of forgiveness. And when the rest of the teens followed, kneeling, in line and saluting the veteran one by one, the crowd stood in a hushed silence, broken only by sobs and the rhythmic snapping of camera shutters, documenting a moment that would soon go viral, not because of scandal but because of healing. And then, microphone in hand, Jeremiah rose with the help of 2 Marines and steadied himself at the podium, his figure lean and tall despite age, his eyes commanding not fear but reverence. And with the hush of a chapel descending over the gathering, he spoke. "Some people see an old man who was pushed into traffic and think the story ends there. But God doesn't stop at pain. God uses pain as an invitation to rise, to lead, and to lift others while you're standing." And he paused, breath catching as he looked over the crowd, lingering on the youth who had once struck him, now weeping. "In uniforms of service, you all came here to honor me. But I stand here today to honor you for having the courage to be better than you were, for becoming the men and women your children will be proud of, and for teaching this city that redemption isn't a myth, it's a mission." And with that, the entire crowd erupted in thunderous applause, some standing on chairs, others embracing strangers, as the Marines began a slow, powerful march down the avenue, their boots hitting the ground in perfect rhythm, their presence casting long shadows in the sunlight. And following them was the youth corps, marching behind in step, not as prisoners of shame, but as the vanguard of change. And at the center of the street, newly renamed Jeremiah Johnson Boulevard, stood a bronze statue unveiled by the mayor himself, depicting a young man helping an elder to his feet with one arm, while holding a book in the other, inscribed, at the base with the words, "From pain rises power, from power, peace." And from that day on, the statue became a symbol for the entire city, appearing on banners, in murals, and even in school crests. while Jeremiah himself became an honorary professor of character and civic leadership at 2 universities, traveling across the country with members of his youth corps to speak in schools, community centers, and correctional facilities, spreading a message that was neither religious nor political, but deeply human, that within every mistake lies the seed of greatness, if only we are brave enough to water it. And in the years that followed, the impact of the incident and its aftermath would reverberate through policy and culture. Youth sentencing reform adopted in 5 states, mandatory civic empathy courses introduced in middle schools, and a documentary titled Semper Fi, the Street That Changed a Nation would win 3 national awards, but none of that mattered more to Jeremiah than the letters he continued to receive every week, handwritten, ink-smeared notes from kids he had never met, thanking him for showing them what it meant to be a real man, a real woman, a real American. And as he aged gracefully, surrounded by community, respected by lawmakers, loved by generations, he kept only one framed photo by his bedside, a candid shot of that moment when Darnell knelt before him, saluting, through tears, with a caption scrawled by Jeremiah himself. This is what victory looks like. And when he eventually passed away at the age of 98, the entire city shut down for his funeral, with flags at half-mast and a funeral procession that stretched over a mile, and thousands lined the streets in silence as the Marine Corps carried his casket draped in a flag, marching past the very intersection where the story began. And among the pallbearers were those same teens, now grown, now leaders, now fathers and mothers, who had taught their children never to judge by skin, by age, or by weakness, but by spirit, by courage, and by love. And as they laid Jeremiah to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, a lone bugler played taps as the wind stirred the cherry blossoms, and the world remembered, not the shove, not the fall, but the rise that followed, the change it inspired, and the day a wall of Marines didn't just protect a man, they built a legacy.